Hello everyone, welcome to Mains Master. So today we'll be taking yet another two polity questions. So the first question is on judicial independence and accountability and the need to balance both. So let me read the question for you. Judicial independence without commensurate accountability does not serve the interest of a democratic polity. Examine. So this is for 10 marks. You have to write 150 words. So there are chances that as you write, as you keep on writing, it might exceed that 150 words, but don't worry at this point. That's totally fine. Okay, so let us see how we can structure this question. Okay, so or how we can meet the demand of this question. So the question speaks about two really important ideas, right? Judicial independence and judicial accountability. And both are technical terms, right? These are not something which every layman understand. So I would say you have to do some definitional, you have to take a definitional approach in the introduction. So what you can do is you can introduce the topic by defining both these things. You could say what judicial independence means, you could say what judicial accountability is, and then you can state the importance of judicial independence, how it has to be balanced with accountability. Or even you don't have to state the importance of judicial, you can say how it is important that judicial independence has to be balanced with accountability, because that is the ideal scenario we are going to further push forward, right? So introduction has to be define key terms, establish the need for balance between both. Need for balance between both, which means you have to state that the balance between both these ideas is good for the larger democratic establishment. So that is the idea, okay? So that is how you have to pull, that is the direction which you have to pull that idea. So in the body paragraph, what you can do is, you have to start explaining ideas, right? You can state what judicial independence, the scenario of judicial independence in India. Judicial independence in India. You could say the different ways in which judiciary has achieved a state of independence in India, and you could also mention the scenario of judicial accountability. So obviously, when you are establishing the scenario of judicial accountability, you are largely trying to look at the weaknesses of it. Okay, so that is the way the negatives, the weaknesses. Or so as of now, the judicial accountability scenario in India is pretty bleak and very less. So you have to say that judicial accountability is very weak, and you can say some of the you can explain it with some of the examples. Then you could say how judicial independence without accountability is bad for democracy. So that is the crux of our question, right? That is judicial independence without commensurate. Commensurate means in equal proportions. Okay, without commensurate accountability does not serve the interest of a democratic polity. So that thing, that crux is going to be answered at this part. How independence without accountability is bad for democracy. Then what you have to say, what can be done? Okay, solutions to achieve this balance. And you conclude. Okay, conclusion would be how, when you implement these solutions in a proper way, you can achieve this balance, and how that would improve or deepen the democracy in this country, improve the scenario of checks and balances in this country. So those are the directions in which you can take the conclusion. So this is the overall structure you have to have. You have to define both the ideas, then you have to establish the need for the balance, then take independence separately, accountability scenario, establish mainly focusing on the negatives or the absence of proper accountability mechanisms in this country. Then you have to say how independence without accountability is bad for the country. Okay, so I think that comparison, that taking both ideas together is really important, because that is going to make your argument much more nuanced, which is going to fetch you more marks. Okay, then you would obviously give the solutions to achieve this much needed balance, and you conclude by saying how achieving this balance is necessary for the larger good. Okay, So that is a structure you should have in your answer, okay? And make sure that you have all this structure. So when you write for the first time, you might not have all this structure. You might have already sent it to the evaluator. But after hearing the discussion, I want you to structure this in this way and make a one more attempt at the answer. Okay, maybe just a 10-minute job. Okay, let us get to the actual content of the answer. So like we mentioned in the structure, we'll start the introduction with the ideas of independence and accountability. So judiciary is the watchdog of the constitution. It is the guardian or the guarantor of constitution in this country. So judicial independence from the executive and legislature is very much essential for in order for judiciary to do that job properly. So that could be your first argument. Okay. Then another thing is that if there is no judicial independence, judiciary cannot effectively provide a check and balance to the executive and legislature. For example, if the whenever the legislature and executive is not functioning properly, it is a independent judiciary that comes into the space and provide the necessary checks and balance. It pushes them into or nudges them into action, okay, through PILs and different ways. So that is the idea of judicial independence and the importance of it. But at the same time, on the other hand, judicial accountability means judiciary being answerable for its own conduct. Answerable for its own conduct means in an efficiency sense of the term, in a moral sense of the term, judiciary has to be like, it has to be above all the, what do you call, all the petty corruption and everything that that is there in the body politic of this country. So both independence or a nice balance or a fine balance between judicial independence and accountability is necessary for effective maintenance of separation of powers and for effective running of the democracy. So these are the ideas with which you can pull an introduction together. Then you move to the in the body paragraphs, you go on to say how it has you have to mention in detail about judicial independence. So you could say that by judiciary acting in another words, or judicial independence helps judiciary to intervene when executive and legislature not I mean it underperforms. So that is one area. So and judicial independence also enhances the public confidence in the judiciary, right? So if the judiciary is independent from the legislature and executive, and the public have a faith that if executive and legislature does something wrong, that there is a third institution to bring them into action, so that increases the trust. That explains the public trust in judiciary also. So judicial independence is necessary in that sense also. And you have to maybe mention about some of the ways in which judicial independence is being ensured through the appointment mechanism. The removal procedure is very hard. They have a security of tenure and all those things. These are the ways in which judicial independence is protected in this country. Then you could start mentioning about the scenario of judicial accountability. But a judiciary given so much powers to bring legislature and executive into action, and which has so much public trust reposed in it, fails to become an effective role model when it comes to the case of accountability. So you could see various instances where judicial accountability has been lacking. There has been allegations of corruption against judges. There has been 2 attempts at impeachment, right? Justice Ramaswamy and Justice Soumitra Sen. Even though it didn't reach to final impeachment, before that they resigned, but somehow those allegations are really a serious blot to the trust factor of Indian judiciary. Then of late there has been allegations of sexual harassment cases against Ranjan Gogoi. Then taking post-retirement jobs. If you look at the case of Shivam and all that, Chief Justice being appointed as a governor, which traditionally has been the parking lot for all retired politicians, right? So that is really a political post. So these are all factors where judicial accountability has been lacking. Then it has kept itself outside the purview of Right to Information Act until last year. Then even though a judicial standards and accountability bill has been brought forward, they has consistently prevented the passing of this bill. So these are the different cases where judicial accountability has been lacking. Then yeah, I think these are some of the examples you can give to show the lacunae in the case of judicial accountability in this country. Now you can go on to say how judicial independence without accountability is bad for the democratic system. So on one side, we have a judiciary which is really powerful, which is independent from executive and legislature influences, which appoints its own judges. That is the extent of independence it has, but on the other hand, it has very weak credentials when it comes to accountability. So what is the consequences of this for democracy? So first thing would be too much power, no accountability. So what is the scenario? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. So that is the Lord Acton's thing. It's very true in the case of judiciary. So that is one thing. Then the case of judicial adventurism, maybe I can just write it down. So the consequences of lack of balance between independence and accountability. One, too much power, zero accountability. So what? Scope for corruption. So it is in this context you have to look at all the corruption allegations against judiciary. So there has been cases of impeachment. Then there is something known as the uncle judge syndrome. So this is when relatives, when both an advocate and judge, they would be relatives, and this advocate would be presenting his or her case before her relative judge. So there are chances, high chances that he would get a favorable judgment. And when these kind of cases come up, people, I mean, the clients would go and take up the service of this advocate because he has a rapport with the judge, right? So that is one thing. Then there is another case of nepotism. This has been brought forward, especially in the case of the earlier Chief Justice, what was his name? Misra, right? So in the earlier Chief Justice before Ranjan Gogoi, in his case, it was said that he rose through the ranks because of his uncle or someone. There was a relative which took him through all the ranks up till the very high up. So there is that scenario. Yeah, then the scenario of judges appointing judges. So that is a consequence of poor accountability, right? So if they are accountable enough, they would have allowed for a more transparent mechanism. Judges appointing judges, again, open scope for nepotism, corruption, and all those inefficiencies and all those. Third thing would be judicial adventurism. Judicial adventurism or judicial overreach. How does that happen when there is no accountability? See, if there is no mechanism, if there is no countervailing force to put the judiciary in order, they would just go on a rampage, going into the domains of legislature and executive, right? They have independence, so they go into all these spaces, but they don't have to be answerable or accountable to anyone. They are more than happy to do it at every other time. So judicial adventurism or judicial overreach is a clear consequence of poor judicial accountability mechanisms. Then what is the issue? Separation of powers gets violated. So in this case, you have to mention the post-retirement jobs. Judiciary taking up post-retirement jobs. So they are basically being indebted themselves. They are so what is the issue when when ex-judicial officer take a post-retirement job with the executive? So we can always allege a quid pro quo, right? So the judicial, for example, the Satashivam guy, so he was the early chief justice, then later become the Kerala governor. So all of us could allege that he was given this governorship just because he has done some favor to the existing government. So it casts some aspersions on the objectivity and the fairness of the judiciary. Okay, so there could be allegations of corruption raised against judicial officers. So that would, the issue is that would weaken the public trust and confidence in this august institution. Okay, so it's as the adage goes, it's not that justice should be served, it should also seem to be so. Okay, people should even feel that justice is being served. So when they take up these post-retirement jobs, that justice being served becomes a false promise. So that is the another consequence. So then you could say, you could see even accountability for their administrative efficiency, right? Pendency of cases. So this is due to lack of judicial accountability, right? Judiciary is not being held accountable for all this pendency of cases. If they were, they would have been much more adept in completing the cases. So the adjournment of cases are all done for extremely flimsy reasons. So maybe some judges who don't like to take up certain cases, they won't take up certain cases on a particular day. There are all kinds of flimsy, non-serious reasons why judges frequently adjourn cases. So extreme high pendency of cases also shows the lack of accountability from the side of judiciary. Okay, so I think these are the consequences for the Indian democracy. I think you can connect it to the consequences, right? Judges appointing judges means what is the issue? All this nepotism, all these things could happen, and this would tarnish the judicial office. Then judicial adventurism, uh, that would be what getting into the no man's land between legislature or executive, or even consciously entering into the actual domain of legislature and executive. So there could be tussles between, this would lead to tussles between legislature, executive and judiciary. Then separation of powers, this post-retirement thing, pendency of cases. So there is so much cases pending, which means it's overall not good for the country. So yeah, and finally, loss of trust in the office. So I think I have mentioned this the other day also. If you don't practice what you preach, people would stop following you, right? So judicial. So here is a judicial institution that keeps on disciplining the legislature and executive for all their wrongdoings. But when it comes to their own issues within their own house, they don't even look at it. They don't even take it seriously. Okay. So eventually, the legislature and executive also would stop obeying judiciary. Then what is the situation? It's a constitutional crisis, right? So the legislature and executive not taking judicial order seriously would immediately precipitate a constitutional crisis. So that is another consequence for the democracy. So these are all the issues when judicial independence is not balanced with accountability. So now you have to speak about how to regain that balance. What has to be done to regain this balance? Now let us see how we can bring this much needed balance between judicial independence and accountability. So first of all, I would say the judicial standards and accountability bill has to be passed. So as of now, it has been put off just because of appointment of one officer or something. Judiciary is not getting on board with the executive when it comes to one or two position, one or two clauses in the bill. So that has to be resolved at the earliest. So immediate passage of judicial standards and accountability bill would be very essential. That would be the essential first step. Then the second thing would be the judiciary has to relook the unconstitutionality judgment of NJAC. Okay, so first thing is judicial standards and accountability bill has to be looked into. The second thing would be NJAC. The unconstitutionality of it has to be relooked, because it has been a mechanism which has been put forward by the parliament and almost half of the state legislature. So they have to take that remit seriously. That is one thing. Then even if that thing is looked into, there has to be, so actually NJC speaks about how judges are, I mean, who appoints judges. So that is the major concern under NJC. Who appoints judges? Should it be done by executive or should it be done by the judges themselves? But this is the only question that NJC answers. What still remains is how judges are appointed. Okay, so that is also a very crucial question if you want to improve the system of judicial accountability. So who appoints judges? Okay, we understand there has to be mix of maybe executive and judiciary in the panel. That is fine. But the process by which they arrive at the name of judges is also equally important. There has to be some objective set criteria which is being followed in countries across the world. That has to be there. Even in the present NJC, that is not actually spelled out. So even this question has to be properly addressed, how judges are appointed. So that would go a long way in enhancing the accountability of judiciary. Then another thing would be having a strict, enforceable code of ethics and code of conduct for judiciary. Okay, so one example that I can give in this context is that there is something known as a restatement of values in judicial life. I think that was initiated by J.S. Verma and some of those judges. So this is about going back to the traditional, the professional ethics which a judiciary had. So that is, if once you become a judge, you cut off your association with a government executive, cut off your association with businesses. So even your marriage, you shouldn't be even marrying to a business family or a government that influential family. You shouldn't go to attend meetings with them, like parties with them. There shouldn't be any out of the official engagements with all other actors, so that there would be absolute trust in judiciary. So that restatement of values in judicial life there has to be some mechanism to implement this restatement of values in judicial life. So this is a very important thing. Then judiciary has to take up the RTI, bringing judiciary under RTI seriously. That is another thing. Yeah, so then another big no is no to post-retirement jobs. Okay, so that is something that would seriously put the all the claims of judicial uprightness into question, because once you start taking jobs from executive as a post-retirement favor, nobody is going to believe you that you have done your job pretty objectively and fairly or justly. Everyone would allege a quid pro quo, or so that is a basic idea of corruption itself, right? You give something and I give you back, and both of this would be from the public money and the public suffers. That is the idea of corruption. So this post-retirement jobs can very much be an avenue of corruption. So that has to be a big no. The judiciary has to, all the higher levels of judiciary has to come together, and they have to bring up a guideline or something. I don't think there is a requirement for a law in that regard. This is something which can be easily accomplished by bringing about a convention. That is something which higher judiciary can do, and they must be doing. And even if they agree that, okay, post-retirement jobs or association with executive is all important, then there has to be a cooling off period before taking up that job. So what is this cooling off period? By cooling off period means it shouldn't be immediately. You shouldn't take the new post-retirement job immediately after your retirement. Okay, that would immediately mean, okay, this is a favor in response. This is a quid pro quo to the service you gave to that government. Maybe you should wait until that government changes or something. Maybe 3-4 years is a good cooling off period. So if they want to take up jobs, at least they have to bring this cooling off period thing. So I think these are some of the ways in which judicial independence can be balanced with judicial accountability. So not all these points is really important. So your conclusion could be something like this: judicial independence is crucial, and it has been rightly made a part of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, and it is essential for making sure that judiciary becomes the ultimate guarantor or the arbitrator as far as the Indian Constitution goes. But at the same time, the lack of accountability or lack of proactiveness in making themselves accountable has maybe diluted the credibility of judiciary in both public light as well as in the official space. So doing all these things properly would help achieve that much needed balance, which will help judiciary to become that crucial third force in the Indian state system, right? That to bring in that much needed checks and balance to the legislature and executive. I think that is some line in which you can conclude your answer. Okay, so I hope you got all the ideas right. That's all. Thank you.